Good evening, everyone. It's nice to see you here. I'm Jack Knott. I'm the Dean of the USC Sol Price School of Public Policy, and it's really my pleasure to welcome you to this very important discussion about law enforcement, intelligence capabilities, and really the implications for issues of equity and civil liberties. I'm also pleased with the collaboration between two research centers in the school, the Safe Communities Institute and the Bedrosian Center on Governance. It really shows the breadth and depth of the expertise that we have on this subject. And before we begin, I also want to acknowledge one person that's here, and that is the U.S. Senator Kamala Harris's Southern California Deputy Director, Heather Hutt. Is Heather here? Thank you for coming. And now it's also my great pleasure to welcome Congressmember Karen Bass to the USC Price School. Welcome, Karen. As you may know, Karen is a Trojan. She has her master's degree in social work from the School of Social Work here at USC. She's also a friend of the Price School. She's been an incredible, generous supporter and involved in our activities, which we very much appreciate. You know, she's primarily an advocate for her own congressional district and her home state of California, but she also has a great care and passion for communities really across the country and around the world. She was elected to her fourth term, representing the 37th Congressional District in November 2016, showing the tremendous support that she has in her constituency, but also allowing her to play a much greater leadership role in the Congress. So she now serves on the House Judiciary Committee and the House Committee on Foreign Affairs, where she is the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Africa. And she was selected by Democratic leader Nancy Pelosi to serve on the Study and Review Chair of the prestigious Steering and Policy Committee that sets the policy direction of the Democratic caucus. So she's emerged in multiple ways as an important leader in the House. Karen also plays a leadership role in the Congressional Black Caucus, where she serves as the second vice chair. Now, throughout her career, she has maintained a focus on youth, on people in communities disadvantaged by special circumstances and by really institutional barriers and policies. Before she ran for office, she was already committed to working for social change in the community. In response to the crisis that gripped inner cities in the 1990s, she started and ran a community-based social justice organization and empowered residents to become involved in making a difference. Her work then, as now, is focused on addressing injustice and inequality. It's an important work, and we are all really privileged and grateful for your presence here this evening. So please join me in welcoming Representative Karen Bass. I'm going to now turn it over to Professor Erroll Southers. I just want to say a word about Erroll. Erroll is the director of the Safe Communities Institute. He is a phenomenal teacher. He's one of the leading researchers in the world on homegrown violent extremism, and so he's a tremendous scholar. But he's also has a phenomenal background in security and in local policing outside the academy, serving in the Schwarzenegger administration, serving with the LAX airports, and focused on homegrown violent extremism and on terrorism. And so he brings that practical experience as well as the scholarship and the teaching. And he is one of the true gentlemen that I know. Somebody who really cares, kind, considerate, yet with great intelligence and wit. So I have a great admiration for him, and I'm very proud that he's a colleague of mine at the Price School. So I want to turn this over to Erroll, and I look forward to this wonderful conversation between the two of you. And I unfortunately have another engagement that I have to speak at right now, and I'm going to miss this conversation, so I'm really sorry to do that. But I'm sure all of you are really going to enjoy it. So please welcome our two, Erroll and Representative Thomas. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Knott, for a very, very gracious introduction. Thank you, Congresswoman, for being here. It's always a pleasure to share the stage with you.
Thank you.
And thank you all for coming this evening. I want to thank my partner, I don't see her here, Aubrey Hicks, who's the Executive Director of the Bedrosian Center. We have some time this evening. It's going to go very quickly. So let me just say a few things. For those of you who came to our summit in November, we had a summit on homegrown violent extremism, a global summit. Thank you very much. We are still leveraging the opportunities and relationships because of that. Thank you, Connie, for being one of our extraordinary keynote speakers that evening. Thank you, Pat and Ira, who were two of my donors for that summit, and we're really, really thankful for all the things you're able to do. For those of you in the audience who have served in the military and served in the law enforcement services, thank you for your service. As the Dean mentioned, he's been here for some time now, and I have to brag about him for a second. When we first got here, the Price School was ranked number 12, and in the short time he's been here, we're now ranked number 4 in the country in the Graduate School for Public Policy, so we're quite proud of that. Let me start with this. As you can imagine, what the Dean didn't mention in my background, I'm a former FBI agent, so it's been a busy day.
That it is.
And I'll be on TV again in the morning. But I do want to thank the Congresswoman for coming. I saw her hearing with the Attorney General. It moved me tremendously. What I want to do this evening is not take anything for granted, although I know that you all know why you're here. But I'd like to run through a short chronology to set the stage for what's happened since August 3rd, when the 12-page assessment was released and where we are now. So on that date, a 12-page assessment went out, and for those of you who don't have it, you can get it. It is what we call unclassified law enforcement sensitive, what we call UOFO, for official use only. And it's titled Black Identity Extremist, Likely Motivated to Target Law Enforcement Officers. And it was prepared by the FBI's Domestic Intelligence and Analysis Unit. What's interesting about that, it was 9 days before you had the white supremacist Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville that turned very deadly. About 2 months later, on October 6th, the report was leaked and made public by foreignpolicy.org. Several weeks later, on November 14th, during the House Judiciary Judiciary Committee, Congress member questioned Attorney General Sessions about the report, during which time he was unable to name one black extremist group, although this report was generated by the FBI, who reports to him. At the end of the month, 2 weeks later, FBI Director Wray met with members of the Congressional Black Caucus when you questioned the methodology of the report and how the FBI actually developed the term Black Identity Extremist. And Wray promised to get back to the group on some of the origins of its assessment. A month later, December 7th, during a House Judiciary Committee, Director Wray defended the Bureau, its personnel, and its mission, which we would expect him to do, despite the president's tweet just 4 days earlier, stating that the FBI's, quote, reputation is in tatters, worst in history. You told Wray that you can't recommend that black activists who are among your constituents even speak to the FBI because it's unclear where the FBI is coming from. So I want to open by asking you, has there been a response from the Attorney General or the FBI Director since any of these meetings, and where do we stand now with the status of this report?
So what the Congressional Black Caucus is calling for now is for the FBI to set up a meeting between members of the CBC and the people that wrote the document, because nobody can account for this. I mean, in my opinion, just to cut to the chase, I don't believe Black Identity Extremists exists. And I believe that the FBI should retract the document and should send out a document throughout law enforcement saying that Black identity extremists do not exist. They gave no information to us as to how they came up with that category. And to me, what they really need to be concerned about is white identity extremists, but that seemed to mystify them.
Okay. So we're all on the same page here. I have to put my professor hat on for a moment. As far as when we talk about extremism, we're talking about something that's radical in opinion, especially in political matters. Extremism is a constitutionally protected right in this country, and so that's something we have to understand and acknowledge. What really concerns me about this report, having been in law enforcement, having been in fusion centers, is that this report's gone out to almost 18,000 law enforcement agencies,
right,
some of which have intelligence departments. Are we hearing about BIE concerns from any local law enforcement or other agencies other than the Bureau?
No. I mean, basically, you know, that document cites organizations from many, many years ago, and it cites the 3 or 4 incidences in which African Americans were involved in killing law enforcement officers. And ironically, the only individual that was connected to an organization was the guy that committed the murders in Baton Rouge, and he was connected to Sovereign Nation, which is a white organization. So, you know, the point of the document is that it's saying that Black identity extremists are organized to kill law enforcement officers. My concern about it is, especially since it was distributed to law enforcement around the country, is that I consider it a declaration of open season on young Black activists that I have a particular concern about, especially people who are involved in the Black Lives Matter movement or any movement that's trying to hold police accountable. And to me, it was just a throwback to the past. It reminded me of my days here in Los Angeles as a young activist protesting the LAPD and the level of repression that we went through. There was nobody we could talk to during those years. And so I feel a very personal responsibility to make sure that that document is retracted.
Let's go back to those years. Oh, go ahead. Let's go back to those years, because those are the years where I probably wouldn't have been an agent because I didn't fit the demographic. But you remember COINTELPRO, and you brought that up during the conversation with the Attorney General. He seemed a little bit taken aback by that. But talk about the counterintelligence program that the FBI had, and we can go through the numerous variations that it's had since 1956.
Well, what I can talk about was what happened here in Los Angeles, and we're also joined by Connie Rice, who is very much involved in this. You know, we had a police chief years ago who he admired J. Edgar Hoover, and so he essentially set up, in my opinion, a local COINTELPRO, and he set up a department called PDID, Political Disorder Intelligence Division, I believe, and they used to, I mean, we couldn't have community meetings. We'd be in a meeting and LAPD would be outside slashing our tires. They would vandalize our cars, broke into our home, would drive up, you know, and assault us. The level of harassment that we went through during those years was very traumatic. And it took the ACLU discovering it to actually bring it to a halt. And what we had to do was, we had to organize and change the city charter, because the city charter did not allow for the police chief to be fired. And you know, we changed the charter, PDID was eliminated, it was a national lawsuit at that time. And so many of us, I was doing international solidarity work at the time, and because some of the work I was involved with involved Cuba, that brought a lot of surveillance, but I was also involved in an organization called the Coalition Against Police Abuse. And so because of that, there was just a tremendous amount, you know, the police was very angry at what we were doing. And again, during those years, there was no one we could talk to. Who could we say? I mean, nobody was gonna believe you that the LAPD was slashing tires and vandalizing cars. And so I feel now that, again, it's my responsibility to not let this happen again. And I think that to protect the young activists, that we have to be very, very, very public about this. Because I think shining a light on it and you know, talking about what's happening will be protection to the young activists.
So on that note, what are the things that you and I have to tell young activists to keep in mind to really avoid that negative interaction with law enforcement, knowing that this assessment has been disseminated?
Well, I think that there's a couple of levels. Again, the FBI is one thing. And, what I'm trying to do now with the Congressional Black Caucus, I want to have a briefing in D.C., and I want activists to come forward if they have been visited by the FBI or experienced harassment or surveillance. We want to have a briefing. We want to hear testimony. Again, we want to shine a light onto that. So one thing I would say to young activists is to please tell us, please let us know if you have had problems. But that's the FBI. Then there's the local police departments. And I worry about our city, but we have a high level of organization here. I'm more concerned, it's not that I'm not concerned about LA, of course I am, but I'm concerned about Alabama and Mississippi and places where these law enforcement folks can completely run amok. And the best example of that we all saw was Ferguson. And to find out that in Ferguson that the police department was raising money for its budget by going out and giving people traffic tickets, and you had a large percentage of the African American population in the entire city that had warrants. And so it's those kind of things that I worry about. And I worry about smaller police departments then feeling as though, anytime, if there's an officer involved shooting, and then there's a group of folks that go out and protest, well, then what deters them from saying, we got Black Identity Extremists. And the FBI says these are dangerous people. And so let's go round them up. You know what I mean? And those are the kind of things I worry about, the signal that it sends, which is why I believe that the FBI have to retract it.
I'm with you. And on that point about local law enforcement treating this as gospel, we did a deep dive on the report. And as you've mentioned already, we had the incident with the officers that were killed in Dallas and killed in Baton Rouge. By the way, both of those shooters in those incidents were United States military veterans, which is something else we had talked about.
Right.
What I find disturbing, and I have to say this, I am very, very proud to be a former agent. We did good work, we do good work, and I'm disturbed to see that there are 6 incidents documented in here to support this report. 3 of those incidents didn't name the individuals they were talking about in the incidents they described, and I had a graduate student yesterday find out who those people were in less than 2 hours. That to me is a little disturbing. What's also interesting about that is when he found them, we found that there was no connection to a Black Identity Extremist organization or ideology.
Right.
And as you mentioned, it was typically associated with the sovereign movement. For those of you who don't know, the sovereign movement is a movement in the United States where they essentially don't believe the United States government is legitimate. One of their big practices is something called paper terrorism, where they file false lawsuits and liens against properties they don't own, and they also don't pay taxes. And so they are very autonomous. They come in every race, gender, ethnicity, nationality. They don't meet, they don't have groups, but they do at least coordinate on how to not pay taxes, and it's out there. The other thing I'd like to share
They know
with
Trump.
The other thing I'd like to share with you, if you want to look at data, we went back and took a look. We work with the Anti-Defamation League here in Los Angeles, and we took a look at their numbers. If you want to see who's killing police officers, and the genesis for this report, and what makes this so important is that this report is saying that this extremist identity is targeting law enforcement. Well, the numbers suggest that 83% of the shots fired incidents we've had since 2009 are right-wing extremists. And so again, as I'm challenged in the report here and trying to be fair, I'm just trying to understand where this data came from and how they put it together.
Right, exactly. And they can't answer that. When we talk to Ray, when we talk to Sessions, Rosenstein, all the people that are getting fired right now, when we talk to them, they could not tell us what the report was based on. And even, when Ray came to meet with us, he knew he was meeting with us about this report.
Sure.
And when they came before the Judiciary Committee, they knew I was going to be there. They knew Cedric Richmond, who's the chair of the Black Caucus. Several members of the Black Caucus are on the Judiciary Committee. So they knew we were going to ask them these questions. And they cannot account for the information in the report. If you can't tell us how you came up with the category of Black Identity Extremists, how could you distribute a document to law enforcement agencies around the country.
Exactly.
What is that category based on?
Did we ever get a response with regards to who approved this report? Did the director accept responsibility for that?
Sort of. He sort of did, but where this came from seems to be a mystery.
Okay. I want to ask you, what are the short, medium, and long-term ramifications of an assessment like this? How does this play out, particularly in communities of color now that it's out there? Short-term,
Well,
long-term.
it's kind of like, when an African-American commits a crime, and I know the black folks in the audience know what I'm talking about, when there's a crime committed, you go like, oh, was it a black person? Because we all feel collectively made to be responsible for what any individual has done. And I don't know many groups like that. I mean, that also certainly happens to Muslims as well. But so my concern is that you have some individuals that killed police officers, and as you said, they were veterans. And the guy in Texas had a history of mental illness. And was, if I recall it right, was even discharged from the military because of that.
That's correct.
But yet, when that individual commits something, everybody's responsible, and so that's what concerns me about this document. And then if you have 3 black people together, that's a gang. So then now they're Black Identity Extremists, because you have. And the funny thing about Black Lives Matter protests is that if you look at the TV, it might be a BLM protest, but it's multiracial.
Yeah.
But yet, it's like psychologically, they say black, so even though the TV screen is showing all kinds of people, that's what folks internalize.
Well, to your point, it seems that the broader issue here is that the identification and the assessment is being automatically determined by the assailant's color.
Right.
And not their ideological motivation.
Right.
And as you pointed out, it seems to be more anti-government than anti-white or anti-black or whatever it might be. So who makes the call? Who made the call that we're going to determine color as the motivating factor, the motivating ideology?
It was funny when I asked Sessions about that. I asked him about, he knew Black Identity Extremists, and he said, well, I sure know that there are black people that are very concerned about their identity. And that's very threatening.
Oh, God.
Black people that are clear they're black, proud of it, know about it, that's very threatening.
Well, I'd like to go to, again, is what we've seen over the last 50 years, if we look at information, police officers killed, and you can see if you look at the data that we have, largely those officers killed in the 70s, early 70s, the 80s, those were largely left-wing organizations motivated by anti-government movements. Students for a Democratic Society, Black Panthers, the Weathermen. It really wasn't about race. In fact, as you know, Congresswoman, many of these groups were interracial and worked together, which is when they became extremely dangerous to the FBI when they coalesced and decided they had a common enemy, and the common enemy was the United States government. And now we see a swing back the other way, where we are seeing more police officers killed by right-wing extremists, and the data bears out. And if I can just go to right-wing, to murders committed by domestic extremists, not just of police officers, but in the country, you can see there 3/4 of the murders committed by domestic extremists in the last 10 years is right-wing extremism. So again, I'm trying to understand the foundation for this report. I just don't understand if they're looking at data, how they would come up with this.
Exactly. And then, I know that this is your area, so I'll just tell you how it feels to me, and you can tell me what's real. When it comes to terrorism, it seems like it's only called terrorism if you're a person of color, especially if you're Muslim. If you are white and go into Planned Parenthood and say you want to save the babies and you shoot up a bunch of people in Planned Parenthood, that's called a guy who had some problems. If you're in Las Vegas, and do what you did, that's not considered terrorism. It seems like it's only labeled as that when it's a person of color.
You're absolutely right. And many people don't know that, Timothy McVeigh was not prosecuted for terrorism. He was prosecuted for using a weapon of mass destruction. Dylan Roof was prosecuted for a hate crime. And I was encouraged to see last year the proposed Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act of 2017, which was actually going to make these other groups, largely right-wing groups, subject to a terrorism statute, which we don't have. As you know better than I do, if you are engaged in an act of what we would determine terrorism here, and it's not connected to an international ideology or an international organization, you're charged with something other than terrorism.
But see, and I wonder about that, because now there are white organizations internationally. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, some of these groups, especially the whole new category of alt-right, which is just white supremacists, they have international connections, but yet they're not categorized that. And what about those guys that were in Washington State or Oregon, that took over, that, you know, they held the land? If those had been some black folks, they would have just bombed that building. I mean, can you imagine that? They took over federal property and they were armed for like a week or two.
It was the Malheur Reserve in Oregon. And as you know, the court case just finished.
And they got off.
Everybody walked.
Right.
Same with the Clive and Bundy incident, where they pointed weapons at the United States Marshals. And as I understand it now, Mr. Bundy, he and his son are going on a victory tour now, and they're recruiting in numerous states because they have figured out, they're saying, we beat the system.
Well, it's also like the gun laws, because, you know, I always tell black folk, I hope they don't think they can follow open carry laws. That doesn't work.
And we both know why we don't have open carry in the United States. We don't have open carry, in California. We don't have open carry in California because of the Black Panther movement. The Black Panthers understood in the 60s that you could open carry a shoulder weapon armed in public as long as it was visible. And people determined that that was a problem. And the state of California took that law away. I've got a photograph at home. I met Bobby Seale, and he's walking into the state capitol with his partner, and they're walking in with a shotgun to debate why they should be able to open carry, and they lost. And that's why California doesn't have open carry. It's the Black Panther Party. It's not because of any other reason. Very interesting. So what I'd like to do is open this up. So, Congressmember, do we know how much this report costs taxpayers? And then who authorized the budget for this report to be developed?
Very good question. I do not know either one. I could tell you in terms of authorizing the budget, I'm sure they did it in just the general F.B.I. budget, but how much that report costs, thank you for asking that question. I will add that to our concerns.
So what was the Attorney General's response to a request to essentially disown the report on Black Identity Extremism when you spoke to him?
Well, he just acted as though he didn't know what I was talking about and said he would look into it. It was kind of funny, though, because the whole time he was there, we were just thinking about Saturday Night Live. we were actually looking at Saturday Night Live videos. My staff there is feeling I'm telling too much information. It is kind of funny to look at him.
So please keep these coming. Very interesting and quite detailed. During the recent State of the Union, President Trump demonized gang membership. He featured two families who had lost daughters to brutal violence by gang members affiliated with Mara Salvatrucha. The following day, Alex Sanchez, a former MS gang member and founder of Homies Unidos in Los Angeles, spoke about the systems in place that created the gangs in the 1980s. Refugees from El Salvador found themselves marginalized, unconnected, and unconnected and away from family systems. How do we address existing systems that are in place to annihilate immigrant communities?
Well, let me just talk for a minute about that, because, I mean, I frankly was in my office during the State of the Union. I couldn't bring myself to go down there and sit there. I just couldn't. But that was particularly offensive, because what he did was the families that he showed were African-American families. Mm-hmm. And the gang he's talking about, Salvatrucha, Salvadorian. And when he talks about immigration, he talks about DACA, Then he talks about diversity visas, which are primarily African and Asian. So it's a constant pitting of folks against each other. What I'm very proud of all of our folks is that none of us are really taking the bait. But how horrific is that, to put on display two families that lost their children, which as being someone who lost my child, that was just so incredibly cruel, you know, to do. But he was cruel, and he feels nothing by it. He did it just to make a point. You know, the whole issue of unaccompanied minors coming across the border, I feel like our country has not taken responsibility for the gang problem in El Salvador, because Salvatrucha happened here. We exported that problem to El Salvador and take no responsibility for our contribution to it. And so to me, I mean, I think, you know, in terms of the systems that lead to gang violence, beyond immigrant communities, I mean, in the African-American community, you know, it's the same. It's when you are disconnected, disaffected, and you do not feel that you have opportunity. I do a lot of work, I travel to Africa a lot, and there's a lot of African countries that have conflicts, you know, wars that are happening, and they're not ideological wars anymore like they were in the 70s and the 80s. And to me, I feel this similarity, where people don't have an opportunity legally, and so they then survive through participating in an illegal economy. Sure. And, you know, the difference in some African countries is they have bigger guns and tanks, but I think that it's similarity in terms of the systems that lead to the conflicts that happen in our community. Let me just take a minute. I see Jan Perry in the back, former councilwoman, head of the Economic Development Department for the city of Los Angeles.
It's always good to remember that we are America, and what happens here, we do have a responsibility to play a role in. I like this next question. How is it acceptable for the FBI to release inaccurate information like this with little accountability, and what can we do to help?
Well, you know, what I would specifically ask of all of you is that if you are experiencing problems, to please let me know, let my office know. If there are problems that you are having, if you've been visited by the FBI, the problem with being visited, and no, you know, tell me if I'm wrong, I don't think I am though, but when the FBI comes knocking on your door and you engage in a conversation, you don't really know what they're after or where they're going, and you can, by mistake or not, lie. And maybe you actually meant to lie because you didn't want to, you know, get in trouble over here or, you know, out somebody, and then you've committed a crime. So, you know, that's why I said in the hearings that if Ray, Director Ray or Sessions couldn't tell me what this document was based on, then I had to tell activists that if they're visited by the FBI, they should not talk to them. Right. Because they don't know what they're after.
An outcome of the FBI stating that black nationalism was the greatest threat to the United States in the 70s, and that is a fact. In fact, in the research that we've done recently, a deep dive on J. Edgar Hoover, he was deeply disturbed about the civil rights movement and the fact that it was something other than what it was portraying to be. They targeted black leadership. Do you fear that current report that we have here will result in targeting, parentheses, killing, black community leaders?
Well, you know, I don't know, but my fear is that any of that could happen. I mean, I will tell you that in Ferguson, some of the activists have died under mysterious circumstances. A couple of them in kind of the same manner. They were shot in their cars burned. And so what I worry about is that if you go out and you have a protest protesting the police, and if the police believe that you are a part of Black Identity Extremists that are targeting law enforcement, then who's to say that there won't be a killing that happens? That's my greatest fear.
Wow. Thank you. With your experience in the FBI, do you think the origins of the report will ever come to light? What I will say is that I don't believe in self-fulfilling prophecies. I do believe that we have individuals out there that target and kill law enforcement because they are the most visible representation of our government. And it's not just a problem we have here in the United States. We see it in the UK. We see it particularly in France, where I spend a considerable amount of time working with them on homegrown violent extremism, because much to most persons' lack of knowledge is that the terrorism issue they have in France is largely committed by
French people, right, exactly.
The individuals involved in Charlie Hebdo were born in Paris, and many people don't know that. So I will say, will it ever come to light? I think, unfortunately, we're going to have people target police officers, and I think that they target them largely because they represent the government. We have hybrid ideologies that can, of course, be combined with anti-government and being racially motivated, but what this report is based on is saying that because you believe in a black identity extremism, you're motivated by race to kill police officers, and that doesn't seem to be the case, at least in the data that we have. How likely is it that the FBI will retract the report, and how do we put more pressure on them for that to happen? We, meaning the general public.
I don't know. I've never done this before. But that's not going to stop me. I mean, I think it's, well, put it this way. We have to build up, and that's why I think it's really important that this has to be kept in the public eye. Because if we don't get them to publicly retract it, denounce it, and send out, clarification, then to the extent that we can be very public about this, we delegitimize it. And now, I'm in kind of this weird space right now because there's this whole other attack going on the FBI that I'm not associated with, because that's being done because this guy doesn't want to be charged with all the crimes I believe he's committed. Mm-hmm. And so, on the one hand, I'm going to protect what's going on over here, but on the other hand, I'm critical, mm-hmm. And so whether they retract it or not, we can generate enough public awareness and public opposition that, law enforcement agencies cannot declare open season on young African Americans and Latinos and other people who are trying to hold police accountable. But one of the things that's going to be required in order to make that happen is for activists to be in communication mm-hmm. and to let us know what is happening to them.
Is there another hearing scheduled at this time?
In the judiciary? My Republican colleagues won't tell us. We're trying to have a hearing, over all of these documents. Mm-hmm. But right now, I imagine there is, I don't know, we're going to see if Trump fires Rosenstein and all that. Mm-hmm. I don't know that they want to bring him back before the committee. Interesting. It's a mess.
What do you feel we can implement in order to hold the FBI and Fraternal Order of Police accountable for targeting the black and brown community?
I think that question is asking if there's a policy or something. I don't know if there could be a policy. Because you could say do not target, but I don't know what that means. You know what I mean?
I do.
So I think it is a question of the culture mm-hmm. and demanding, the culture. I mean, one of the things that Comey said that I appreciated, even though I had issues with Comey, mm-hmm. He said that on his desk he kept the file of Martin Luther King.
Absolutely, yes, I do.
And he kept that as an example of the FBI run amok. Mm-hmm. And he wanted to set that standard that not happen again. Okay. I don't know when this memo was done, but.
Wouldn't it make the most sense for the recent report, this report, to use similar definition constructs to those that already exist? I have to say, as the academic on this issue, I'd say yes. Why not black supremacy, or more to a model where we talk about white identity extremism?
Well, yeah, and black supremacy, I'm not even really sure what that is, but I do think white identity extremists, I asked Sessions that. Did he know about white identity extremists?
Okay.
He said he didn't.
Yeah.
He's actually named after two white identity extremists.
I thought it was really interesting when you had to remind him about the Klan. That was a classic moment.
Yeah.
He just forgot.
Now, I know that the FBI does have, the category of white supremacy, but it's interesting because the way they look at it is different. They have white supremacist groups, but they don't have any concern about white supremacist groups attacking law enforcement.
Correct. And that's what makes this report so damning, is not that we're talking about an extremist ideology, but the target of the ideology.
Right.
And that galvanizes everybody. When you start targeting cops, people can rally around that. And to me, that's what's most disturbing about this report. Yeah. What type of support should local and national groups such as the ACLU do to support the Congressional Black Caucus or other efforts to challenge this designation?
Well, I think bringing us data, I mean, what happened in LA, what eventually broke up what law enforcement was doing, this whole division that they had called PDID, we called it as activists, we called it the Red Squad. And again, we had to go to court. There were over 100 plaintiffs. Gates had files on everybody. He had files on Mayor Bradley. He had files on, He had files on Mayor Bradley. You remember this, Connie. He had files on members of the city council. Because basically what he was doing was, he was kind of threatening the council in the sense of, I got files on you, so you can't really move on me. But the ACLU, what they did was they documented all of the surveillance and all of the harassment, the stuff that I was telling you that happened, the slashing of the tires, the violence, the vandalism and all. And the other thing that the LAPD was doing at that time was, they infiltrated our organization. So we'd be in a meeting and there'd be 20 people in the room and about 4 of them were undercover, undercover police officers. So the ACLU documented this, and then through a lawsuit that lasted a couple of years, and it was a national news story at the time, that by shining the light of day on it and holding the police department accountable, they were able to shut down the unit. We eventually were able to get rid of the police chief, and LAPD had to go through a whole culture change because this department just targeted activists, and it wasn't just activists that were doing police accountability work. It was activists that were working on pretty much any issue. And so I think that's the way the ACLU can be. It was the ACLU that brought this department down. And so I think in the same way the ACLU can play the same kind of role, provide the legal support. In the Congressional Black Caucus, now, if Democrats were in control, the Congressional Black Caucus could do all of this through Congress.
Right.
But needless to say, my Republican colleagues are not going to allow the resources to do the investigating, and that's what the ACLU could do.
Great. I want to go back to your comment about the infiltration. What many people don't know is the counterintelligence program that the FBI created back in 1956. Their first one was called COINTELPRO. COINTELPRO, white hate, went after the Klan. In 1964, that program lasted for 7 years. Then they actually had a COINTELPRO, black hate, which went after activist movements and mostly civil rights. But what's interesting about your comment on infiltration, they actually created a program that was a ghetto recruitment program, and that's what they called it, actually. It was we had a ghetto informant program.
Oh, my.
That's an F.B.I. program that was formed in 1967, and it was to recruit informants, and in 1 year, the F.B.I. had 3,000 informants listed in a database. So the infiltration that you saw here with Chief Gates was an old strategy that the F.B.I. knows very well. So this question asks, it says, let's be honest. African Americans have been targets in this country for centuries, and nothing has changed. What inspires you to continue to fight for justice, rights, and equality?
Well, I have to, and I don't accept that nothing has changed. I think one of the things that's tough is that we take 2 steps forward and 3 steps back, and there's a segment of our population in the country that was so traumatized by that black family in the White House that they produced this guy. You know what I mean? Seriously. And so we took steps forward and we took major steps back. And I'll just tell you guys, which I think you might know, but seriously, everybody's focusing on Russia. But let me tell you something. While we're all paying attention to this soap opera, the wreckage that they're doing through all of these federal agencies, it's going to take us years to get back. I mean, the Department of Justice dismantling the civil rights units, the Environmental Protection Agency, you know, all of the issues that really impact, you know, our communities, they're just running through these agencies and tearing them up, firing all the staff. They've banned words, certain things you can't say, you know. And so, but to me, you know, I made a commitment as a kid watching the civil rights movement on TV that it was my responsibility to devote my life to fighting for social and economic justice. That's my responsibility. Well, thank you. I never thought that was going to result in me being in Congress, but you know, you play that role in different ways at different points of your life. We used to call it one struggle, many fronts. And so I think that that's my responsibility. And you know, like I said, the reason why I feel so passionate about this issue is because I went through it. And I just I can't accept a whole nother generation going through the same thing. So, but I'm inspired. I mean, and you know, you see me, you know, I joke, well, you have to laugh, otherwise you cry. But but the thing about what this guy has done, though, that I think is really important, and oftentimes I think activists we don't realize when we have won something. And I say everywhere that, you know, Trump said he was going to bring the country together, and he did that. You know, he did. He brought us all together in opposition. And I say that seriously because we now, I mean, he has spawned a level of movement that we call the resistance, where you have people working across category on issues. I was going to the airport the day the Muslim ban came out, and I couldn't even get to United Airlines for all the people that were out protesting. And there were people carrying signs in support of immigrants that I'm sure never thought about supporting immigrants before. When I looked at the march in Charlottesville and also Boston, that was a march against racism, and I sat there and did this triple take at the TV because it was almost all white. Right. Oh, you had tens of thousands of white folks out protesting against racism, and it wasn't necessarily it wasn't like black folks called all the white folks out. And so that's, to me, an incredibly positive development, that you have people that are so offended by what is happening now that they have decided to move into activism in a way that they hadn't before. To me, that inspires me to believe that come this November, we will make a significant change. We have to change the House, and we have to change the Senate, and then we eventually have to take back the White House. But for all of you that want to see him impeached, be clear. If he's impeached, you have President Pence. And President Pence is an ideologue, and he's not crazy. So, you know, and Trump is not an ideologue. Trump believes in Trump. And so Pence is no solution. And so we have to take back the White House in 2020.
Since we've talked about history tonight, we've spent some time over the last several decades knowing what the FBI has done and been quite successful at these movements. This is a very interesting question. Do you believe the purpose of this report was solely to slow down the Black Lives Matter movement and others like it?
I don't know if I would use slow down or attack.
And the second part is, and if so, do you believe it's been successful in doing that?
I don't think the document has. I think that the Black Lives Matter movement, first of all, it's a very different type of movement than the movements I grew up with. And so I don't think you see the level of protests that you did before, but I don't think that that means that the movement has gone away.
Okay. I really want to thank you for bringing this to light in the hearing, because this next question is one that I can't actually answer in detail. Perhaps you can. This person asked, can you explain how the report was leaked? It is concerning to think about what other unfounded material the FBI is distributing that the public is not aware of.
I have no idea how it was leaked. And it does scare you, because if that's one thing, though, that's happening, which is kind of a good thing. I mean, when you see Trump attacking the intelligence Department, the intelligence agencies and law enforcement and the media, that's like really stupid. I mean, because those are the folks that are going to come get you.
Right.
So I have not been surprised at all about all the stuff being leaked. One thing I'm a little worried about, though, is that so many people are quitting the administration that then you worry about what's left. You know, I deal a lot with the State Department because of the work I do on Africa, and there's nobody minding the store. I mean, as much as he talks about Korea, we don't even have an ambassador to South Korea.
You're absolutely right. I was in France twice last year. When I went to France this past 6 months, the State Department, who typically supports my visits there for my research, couldn't do it. They didn't have the funding. I wound up getting supported by the University of Paris to be there for my work. And now I can't even go back. And they're,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
and they're doing some pretty innovative work there where they're tying radicalization to the mental health space, and they're looking at this as a medical issue.
Wow.
And I think they're a little bit ahead of us there, and we want to work together, and we don't have the support.
Well, so did you hear that the president of France is trying to recruit all the environmental scientists
Yes.
from the United States? He said, why don't you come work with us for
Sure did.
3 or 4 years till you get rid of this guy?
Yeah, and then the other thing I have to say personally is in the last week, I've had 2 friends who are FBI agents in LA, one is a fraternity brother, who are leaving, and neither of them are retirement age. That's disturbing. That's talent, that's expertise, that's experience, and that's 2 guys who really love the Bureau, who for whatever personal reasons have decided they're going to leave now. The systemic oppressions feel so deep and deeply rooted. Do either of you feel we are actually making change? It feels like we need a hard reset.
I do think we need a hard reset. But, you know, again, I think, and I hope that people in the audience don't feel discouraged, really. I mean, hang on to the part of this that people are being activated. And I think that we all are paying a very painful lesson, because I think in the 8 years of Obama, I think we got complacent. I think we got complacent. We thought we had elected a messiah and everything was going to be fine. We didn't need to do anything. We learned that he was a president, and presidents can do, you know, they have their limits. But, you know, with this administration, they've all slapped us across the face. And hopefully we can use that slap in a positive way and increase our activism and recommit and be rededicated to what we need to do to change this country. Let me just acknowledge, thank you. Judge David Cunningham in the back.
Well, this is a very interesting question, and I want to, again, I'm going to do this all night. Thank you for what you do, your courage and your steadfast commitment to what you believe. How do your white Congressmember colleagues react to you calling for a retraction of an FBI report?
Well, my Democratic colleagues, you know, that's 100% support. My Republican colleagues, I think, are a little perplexed. I don't think they, to be honest with you, I don't think they knew or cared. I mean, I don't think they're opposed to me calling for a retraction. I think this is just not even on their radar. Right now, you know, they're all busy beating up the FBI, so.
I never thought I would see the day that the FBI became the enemy of the state. Some of the questions I got today, and I know I'm going to get tomorrow, are just making me really shake my head. But I've always said it's not. The FBI has been targeted by other presidents, and it didn't turn out well for them.
Exactly. Exactly right. And I mean, he's attacked all 17 intelligence agencies and the press. But you know what's one of the things that's really scary in our country right now is that he's got his own TV station, Trump TV. I mean, that's Fox.
And that's where he gets his intel.
Well, exactly, because he's watching it 5-6 hours a day. But I mean, literally, you turn on Fox, and I think it's important to watch Fox every now and then. They're covering something completely different. It's like, it's not a matter of this is the news and this is my opinion. They're just covering something completely different.
What happens if Sessions and the FBI refuses to retreat? I'll put you on the spot with the second part of the question. I think you've answered it. Would you support a motion to impeach Trump? And the third part of this is, has the FBI ever studied white identity extremism?
Well, I asked Sessions that, and again, they do look at white supremacy, but not in the context of what we're talking about.
Right,
in
that's
terms of
correct.
attacks on law enforcement. In terms of what happens if they don't retract it, well, I think that, again, I think we have to fight back, and the fight back is when there is surveillance, when there are investigations, when there is harassment, we have to fight. That might mean lawsuits, that might mean legislation hearings, but I do think we have to be very, very aggressive in fighting back on this. And then in terms of impeaching Trump, I have voted on it twice, but I'm not one, I mean, this might sound strange, I don't really want him to get impeached right away because I want November to happen, and I'm really worried that in the psyche of the masses of people that they might feel if Trump goes away that everything's okay. And because, Pence has played it brilliantly. Most people don't really know who he is or what he's about. He's kept his head down. He doesn't make really crazy statements. But if you look into this guy, he's serious business. And so I worry that if he became president tomorrow, people would exhale. And I don't think, so I want him to be impeached like in January. After after we've taken the House back. And I say that because if we have President Pence in January, and if we have taken the House and the Senate back, we can stop stuff. And even if we've taken the House back and not the Senate, we can still stop stuff. The other thing that and I know people are thinking about, but think very seriously about it, and I'd have to put the judge on the spot about this, probably the things that is one of the scariest things they're doing are the judicial appointments. And because those are lifetime appointments, and somewhere down the line, we have to figure out how to get rid of these folks because, there's one guy that's getting ready to come up from North Carolina who's an open white supremacist. I mean, just open. He was a part of Jesse Helms' staff. He's the one that brought the lawsuits where they threw out the redistricting because they said they had surgically targeted African Americans. This is who they put forward as a judge. And then you probably saw the interview with the guy that didn't know anything about the law. Did you see that interview? They asked him.
Yes.
I think he'd never been in a courtroom. And there was another guy, I guess, that was into ghosts. So every time they talked about him on the news, they played the theme from Ghostbusters. Seriously, they are appointing people that are really, really bad.
They sure are. Do you think that the increased framing of law enforcement-related incidents as racial serves to artificially inflate racial tensions, and exacerbate anti-police sentiment? And I want to go on. What role does the media play in driving these tensions, and what role do we have as citizens to unite as Americans to transcend race?
Well, I think that it's our responsibility to call out racism. And like I said, I think it's a tremendous development to see the tens of thousands of white folks who are out protesting against racism. And I think it's, critical that we do that. And I think, in terms of other things that we can be doing now, there's so many different ways that you can become active. And you don't always, not everybody has to go out and march. I mean, there's a lot of ways that people can be active, and there's virtually no excuse for people not to be active now.
That's absolutely true. You're right. I was really proud of my daughter when she was out there at the airport that day, along with thousands of other people marching. So someone wanted me to remind us that there are some, quote, underlined, old activists out here too. So I've read that.
Okay, raise your hands. All right.
While the BIE report should be retracted, the seed has already been planted.
Yeah, that's right.
Law enforcement has and continues to target populations of color. What steps can truly be taken to destroy our rotten foundation that has been built on racism and reinforces institutional racism?
Well, you know, I mean, I certainly can't sit up here and say I have a quick solution. I think what's sad in our country is that, you know, what Trump has done has unleashed it. It's not like it wasn't there. It's just that he has given permission, validation, support for, tried to normalize. And I think that that's what we have to push back against, because it has to be, you know, we cannot accept it. It's not acceptable. Mm-hmm. But then there's that overt racism. But the institutional racism is something, again, that once we are past this time in history and Trump is gone and we've taken back over and we can repair some of these institutions, the institutions have to be held accountable. And that's part of what the Trump administration has torn down. Mm-hmm. The accountability measures that we can all debate as to how well they worked, but it was the only thing we had, has now been torn down. And maybe when they get rebuilt, it's an opportunity to have them rebuilt with much more force. And let me just say something, since we all live in this bubble of California, and we really live in a bubble. You really do. Mm-hmm. And we're in a double bubble because we're in LA. But one of the things that we should do as a state is we should reverse Proposition 209, the anti-affirmative action proposition. There might be the climate to do that now, because we've changed so much demographically and politically in this state. Mm-hmm. And for those of you that don't know what I'm talking about, it's the ballot measure that happened, Proposition 200, over 20 years ago, wasn't it? That essentially outlawed the ability to factor in race in contracts with the state and also in college admissions. The USC is a private school, but for public colleges. So just in terms of the contracts, 1% of the contracts with the state, and that's contracts for everything, 1% was going to people of color. 1%. And so Proposition 209 took that away. And so, because we're in this bubble, we should think about building the movement to reverse Proposition 209. It was a little tool to help deal with institutional racism.
Is there any way these questions of where or how did the FBI come up with these titles can be brought up again before the FBI director and AG so they can answer these important questions, and what progress has been made? And I think we've pretty much covered that.
And next week, I don't know who the FBI director and the AG are going to be.
I was interviewed yesterday about whether or not Director Wray should be ready to resign, and I had to be honest and say, yeah, we just don't know. I mean, with this current climate and this president, nothing is for sure, and he is certainly under fire and is going to remain under fire until something happens, and I hope it's not his resignation, but it may very well be.
Well, when they asked him, Trump, about Rosenstein today, the press asked him, are you going to fire him? And he said, well, what did he say? Well, we'll see about that. Or, what do you think? What do you think? That's what he said. What do you think? So I think he is sending all the indications.
Mm-hmm. I have to tell you that there was 2 times this past year where I was asked by the Congressional Homeland Security Committee to come in and talk about homegrown violent extremism, and it got canceled twice. And then finally, when they gave me the call, the hearing was on Friday, and they asked me on Wednesday if I could be there,
right.
Along with my colleagues, 3 others around the country. And so as a result, the hearing wound up being the Secretary of Homeland Security and the FBI director, and they spoke on homegrown violent extremism. And I guess you know how that turned out.
Well, by the way, one of the reasons that happens is because, again, the Republicans are in charge of everything, which, by the way, I hope that we all learn what that means now, because I think a lot of times, even though we're well educated, I think a lot of times people really don't understand what it means when one party has taken over the 3 branches of government. And so the Republicans have a hearing, and then they give the Democrats a 24-hour notice. And so they do that intentionally, and there's not much you can do about it. That's why you have to take the House back. I mean, we can talk all day long about the strengths and weaknesses of the Democratic Party. But as long as our country is a two-party system, and we know the root of that is money, as long as that happens, we can't be ambivalent anymore about the differences between the two parties, because I think we have seen what happens when one party is in control of everything.
Mm-hmm. It's an interesting question. Why do you think African Americans are so hated in this country and other places in the world?
Well.
I'll at least answer part of that. I'll tell you now that in my travels internationally, the only thing I get consistently are people coming up and apologizing for what's happening here now. Strangers come up to me and say, I'm really sorry about what you're going through. And I guess I must look American wherever I go. But it happens to me in Israel. It happens to me in France. It happened in London last month. And they just come up, total strangers, and say, I'm really sorry about what you're going through.
You know, it's interesting because when I deal with foreign delegations, and I do all the time, I have to, when I go in a room and everybody's sitting there looking at me, waiting to see kind of where I'm coming from, and I have to walk in the room and I have to say, I know he's crazy, everything's a mess, now can we start the meeting? And because it literally, I mean, there's like this tension that's there until you acknowledge what's going on. So I wind up having to apologize all the time. So, you know, after his stupid comment about Africa, you know, in Washington, D.C., the African Union has a building in Georgetown. And so all of the ambassadors, all 55 of them, meet. There are 55 countries in Africa. I'm sure he has no idea that. But anyway, so I asked immediately, after he did those comments, I called immediately and said, can I please come over and speak to all the ambassadors? And I went over, and I mean, I know, you know, a lot of them, I work with them, and I went over and I said, I'm here to apologize. I'm here to apologize on behalf of the Congress. I'm here to apologize on behalf of the country. And I just went off and said, this is what I think of him. And I am sorry, and this is not the way Congress feels. It's not even the way my Republican colleagues feel about Africa. Africa, very interestingly, race is so fascinating. Africa is a very bipartisan issue. African Americans aren't, but Africa is. And then you know, you can say why are black people hated so much. That's one way to look at it. The other way to look at it is that black culture is loved. I mean, you can't go any place in the world and not see our mark. And not just the mark of Africans, but African Americans. Everywhere in the world. You know, turn on Korean TV and you will see folks, you know, you'll see hip hop. I mean, you know, so it's kind of crazy. But I mean, you know, yeah, you can look at that side of it, but there's the other side of it as well.
I know you
and the other, I'm sorry, one other part of that piece in terms of African Americans is that our struggle is acknowledged and recognized. So part of them saying that to you was because you're a black man. And I have found that around the world. People acknowledge, they know about U.S. racism. It's funny, a lot of people in the United States don't seem to know, but people around the world do. And then when we're talking about this element, the racist element in our country, you know, we aren't talking about the majority of the country, and I think that has been exposed by Trump. It's just the problem is that hardcore minority is the one that's running things right now. But because they are the minority, we can get it back.
You know, I know you have a pretty exciting weekend coming up. If you want to share where you're going to be on Sunday with everyone, because I want everyone to know. I'm
leaving to go back to D.C. tomorrow because on Sunday I'll be on State of the Union on CNN.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for what you do. So before we close, I'd just like to say again, thank you, everyone, for coming. We had some pretty incredible questions here. This is a very, very serious issue and one that hopefully will not go away. Thank you for your passion. I want to just ask you for any closing remarks you have, thoughts you might have that we didn't discuss this evening, although we had a pretty broad spectrum here of questions, and you guys did really well, but thank you for sending them up here. But any closing remarks you'd like to make?
I just want to say to people, you know, I mean, I live with these folks every day. And I am energized and inspired and positive and hopeful. And we all have a responsibility to be that way too. Because if you are not, then you've essentially conceded. And I'm just not willing to concede. I'm old enough to know that this is a moment in history and that this time shall pass. But we have to take advantage of this time. We have to view all those crazy tweets as gifts because they're organizing gifts. And we have to use what's going on. We have to use what's going on to change this. And then we got to remember the lessons that are learned. So you can't just elect people to office and think they're going to solve all your problems. Being in office does not work if there is not an outside movement that pushes things in the direction that they need to go. That's what I have to say.
So before I let the Congress member get away, I just want to, again, thank all of you. For those of you who want to know and listen to real extremists, on Monday, we will have a forum at the Price School at noon. I happen to be on the board for Life After Hate. Life After Hate is an international organization of former neo-Nazis and right-wing extremists. Wow. Pete Simi, my colleague from Chapman, and I will be there on Monday. We have Tony McAleer, who used to head the White Aryan Resistance, Angela King, who used to be a neo-Nazi, and Sammy Rangel, who used to be with the Latin Mercenaries. They're going to be there to talk to you about how they were radicalized and how they disengaged from the movement. And that'll be at noon at the Price School. But please join me in an appropriate thank you for Congressmember Karen Bass.